What's up, good people of the world? So we have a lot to cover today. Hopefully it will be fun. I apologize, there's a slight static in the microphone. I was trying to figure out what it was, but I couldn't really figure it out. Hopefully it's not too distracting or bothersome. So as you can see, I kind of slightly cheated a little bit. I was thinking about the Fugue subject last night about 4 in the morning, and I was thinking, and I realized that it not only worked with itself in Canon with one entry, but with 2 entries, and then I kind of started writing and continuing it into like a cadence in my head, and then I realized I just had to get up and and finish it, and I couldn't record because it was super late at night, and I wouldn't be able to talk, otherwise my roommates would get super angry. So I just wrote the ending. I just started this big stretto at the end and all the way up until the coda. It's quite a bit of music, so for the rest of the Fugue, I promise I'll write it on screen. But in this case, I'm just gonna have to go through and explain and show you what I did, because I was just inspired, and you got to go with inspiration when it strikes. Before we get into this, though, one thing I want to say about this series, because a couple people asked some good questions in the comments the last few videos, the last 2 videos, I should say. The first thing is that this is not meant to replace a course in counterpoint, like a systematized course or a good book, a good counterpoint textbook, and it's not meant to replace a course in Fugue or read it. You should. I'm assuming that you know what a Fugue is, you know what a subject is. I'm still going to explain things as I go along, just to kind of refresh and kind of my own take on them. But it's not like I'm going through this systematically, because if I were to do that, there are courses on Fugue that take like an entire semester to complete, and even that's just barely scratching the surface. So, my goal with this YouTube video series was really to just take all of these concepts that, you're familiar with, like, counterpoint, the rules of counterpoint, and what constitutes Fugue, and, it's the basic structural components, and show you how to apply them to the actual process of composing a Fugue, right? Because that's what you don't get in the textbooks, and so that's what I'm, trying to offer. So, yeah. But in any case, let's get to the Fugue. Okay, so before I kind of explain what I did, which will take a while, and I want to make sure and go ahead and do interval analyses so you can see how the rules of counterpoint are applied. There are a couple of concepts that I realized I forgot to talk about the very first episode, so I'm just going to run through them really quickly because they're very important and very relevant. So one thing that is very important to differentiate when you're dealing with counterpoint, pretty much of any kind and of any time period, is instrumental versus vocal counterpoint, right? And the rules are the exact same, but when you're writing instrumental counterpoint, there are certain things that certain freedoms you are allowed that are not considered to be good vocal writing, right? So you could have leaps, you could have melodies that have a much larger range than the human voice. One common thing, which kind of is 2 concepts packed into one, let's say we have a cadence in E minor, you'll often hear Bach do something like this, right? Or something like that. And so there are 2 ideas going on with this. One is the idea of compound melody, right? Within one line, we sort of have 2 sub-melodies embedded. This one, ya-da-dum, right? And then we have this melody, ya-da, and of course it would resolve, ya, but he displaces it by an octave. So that's an important thing to realize, is that this line, ya da 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 da, it's very difficult to sing. If you were writing vocal counterpoint, which the medieval counterpoint and Renaissance counterpoint was mostly vocal music, you wouldn't see this type of thing. But in Bach fugues, the more instrumental, he still sometimes writes organ fugues and piano fugues that are written vocally, and they have nice lines. And to be honest, this fugue that I'm writing, I want to try and make it as vocal as possible, in the sense that you can easily sing all of the individual lines. But you do see things like this, and you do see a leading tone resolved by octave displacement, and it sounds weird, and like if you just listen to the voice by itself, to hear a voice go right, because it's a major 7th, right? So it's a bit odd, but you hear it quite a bit in his Bach's instrumental music, and it's basically just you are resolving the leading tone, you're just displacing the resolution by an octave, and sometimes that works out advantageously if you need that low octave, depending upon what the voicing is. Another thing is our toccata figurations. that these types of things, these are very, very difficult to sing. Dee da dee da dee da dee da dee da dee. Right, it's like almost impossible to sing, right? But completely okay in instrumental counterpoint. So when you're writing a melodic line and you go back and you study Fuchs's book, remember that his rules for melodic line are really vocal rules, and they don't necessarily apply. You still want to try and make well-balanced melodies, but you're a bit more flexible in terms of writing something that would be difficult for singers agility-wise to sing. Let's see, what else did I want to... Oh yeah, there was one other thing I forgot to mention regarding the counterpoint rules. You don't want to approach direct fifths from a dissonance, and this also includes the fourth, right? So for example, if you had something like, let's see here, if I did, I don't know why I want to do it in B5, but whatever, that works. Something like this, right? So, we have a fourth, right? And the fourth is treated properly. So technically, on this, the reason I'm bringing this up is because on the surface level, this looks correct, right? It looks like you have a major third, right? And then you have a dissonant neighbor tone, which resolves back up to where you want it to, right? And then the note of resolution just leaps. One of them moves by step, and the other one leaps, and the note that's leapt to constitutes a consonance. In this case, a perfect consonance, a perfect fifth. But, they didn't like this and use this too much in the Baroque style because of the fact that the fourth or any other dissonance, right before the perfect fifth really brings out the sort of harsh character of the perfect fifth, or rather sort of like stone-like kind of purity of it, right? It's kind of a bit of a medieval sound. Right, so that's something that you want to try to avoid. Don't approach only approach a direct fifth from a consonance, right? And just to reiterate, you only are going to approach direct octaves when you have cadence points, where you have to have this sort of bass motion with Ti-Do and Sol-Do. Other than that, you never see in Bach's music, at least, you never see direct octaves. Okay, so just wanted to make sure those were clear. Okay, so I guess first I'm just going to go ahead and play it, and then I'll explain what I did. So one little thing, one of the ways I love, one of the reasons why I love Bach's Codas, he's really good at writing endings for fugues, is because of the fact that he makes you think it's the end, and then there's a deceptive cadence or something, or there's like a diminished seventh chord, and it's like, well, wait, no, hold on a second, and then so there's sort of like 2 or 3 psych endings, if that makes sense. And so that's something that I kind of tried to do here. I kind of tried to signal the end, and I figured this is something that's going to happen after the middle of the fugue, right? Where you end on a cadence, and you hear the lower 2 voices drop out, and you just hear the high voice, and they enter in succession. When you hear a stretto like that, where things drop out, and then you just hear the voices entering, it really, if you're an experienced fugue listener, it's something that lets you know, the end is near. Not in an ominous way, but in a triumphant way. So let me just go ahead and play it. I just put these dynamic levels here so that they can be heard easily. I almost went yeah ba ba ba, but I know I do that too often, so I just went ahead and went with this with an octave displacement. So yeah, and oftentimes you get with Bach, you get these last little progressions that are really chromatic, and it's just like you know what I mean. So I'll definitely explain how that works. So yeah, I hope you like it. So that is going to be the ending of our fugue. So let's go through this bit by bit. First, I'm just going to go through and explain it in terms of formal structure, like the basic key centers, how we modulate from one key to another, why I modulated to those key centers. and where the entries are placed and why they're placed that way. And then we're going to go back to the beginning, and I'm going to do an interval analysis because I think it'll be helpful. It's going to be a little bit tedious, but I'm going to do an interval analysis of this all the way to the end between each of the voices. Okay, so first we have in literal canon, which it's fun. This is not always possible. I'm continuing to be amazed at the possibilities of this fugue subject. We just accidentally happened upon. So we've got the subject in all three voices, pretty much full statement. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Excuse me. Right. And then of course. Right, and then of course this. I basically, for the sake of filling in this rhythmic duration here, I added a lower neighbor to get to the next note. So I'm amazed that all that worked out. And then basically what I wanted to do here was I wanted to kind of arrive at some sort of because you'll notice one of the things that happens when you have a canon and stretto like this, it's like this. We have these individual melodies, and as you know, the melody implies harmony, right? Like a yum da da dum 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 dee da 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 da. The moment it gets there, ya da da da, we're not on the tonic anymore, right? It really implies a 4 chord or maybe a 6 chord, right? In this style, it'd be more likely a 4 chord, right? And then ya da, that sounds like 5 of 3, and then ya da, that sounds like a 4/3 suspension on the 3 chord, right? But you'll notice that since it's superimposed over itself at different levels, you're sort of getting conflicting harmony, and while it all works out contrapuntally in terms of intervals and dissonance resolution, the harmony is a bit obscured and ambiguous, and so it's very important after you have a big stretto like this, especially if it's a canonic stretto, to kind of get back into a harmonically oriented kind of thing leading up to a cadence, which is what this was, right? This was kind of a deceptive cadence, going from a 5, a kind of implied 5. We don't have the leading tone. Going to 6, right, and then finally ending up at a cadence here, right, and then we break into 2 voices, right. Yeah, and it's also, I would say, it's very important in a fugue to have moments where there are just 2 voices interacting with each other. This is one of the things that I see a lot with the amateur fugues, like on YouTube and stuff, and student fugues. 2 things. One, it's just all if they have a 3-voice fugue, it's all 3 voices going all the time. And Bach, first off, that just wears your ears out to just have 3 voice counterpoint, just nonstop. Right, so it's a good idea to leave a voice out for a second and just have the alto and soprano work together, or just the alto and tenor work together. Now you can have the soprano and bass, that's okay, but when the parts are really far apart, they kind of lose harmony with each other because their overtones aren't in close proximity, and so they didn't do that a lot in the Baroque period, but you can do that today. No one's going to kill you for it. And then the other thing is just to drop out voices every now and then, and I could definitely do this more. In this piece, I think there was a moment, that's where it brings back in. Yeah, like right here, where you have a rest for voices, da dee da dum, yum da da dum dum. It does 2 things. One, it brings attention to the voice, because when you drop a voice out, then when it enters back in, because you noticed its absence, you notice it coming back in, right? So, and it's often a good idea to do that with the middle voice, because the middle voice, like I've said before in the previous videos, it's the one that can often just go unnoticed and sort of sink into the texture, because it's not on top, which your ear usually hears, and it's not the thundering bass. So it's a good idea to drop a voice out, and it also, just from a sheerly melodic perspective, we got to realize, like, we're at the end of the day, we're trying to write melodies, and melodies have rests in them, right? Melodies are not just nonstop, and so. Yeah, and that's definitely something that I struggle with. I tend to have I tend to want this rhythmic vitality, but, Bach is really good with adding well-placed rests in his fugue, so I would definitely recommend studying and paying attention to those types of things in his music. So yeah, so you can see it all works out nicely. These voices are together with those parallels and sixths, and these voices are together with the parallel sixths. All works out quite nicely. And right here, which again is basically just it's sort of a modal, because we think of this as a 5 chord. Right, it turns into a 5 chord. It doesn't have the leading tone, so it's a modal. We call it an Aeolian cadence. But instead of going to E minor, we go to C major, so it's a deceptive cadence, right? Right, and we have another deceptive cadence, but this time with the leading tone. Right, going to a C major chord, what sounds like a C major chord, right? And it turns out to, it's kind of a, this is something that's called this 5-6 technique. It's where you go from the 6th chord to the 4 chord, or if you're in major, it's where you go from the 4 chord to the 2 chord. Right, and here's where we get the cadence, finally. Okay, E minor, we're there, we've arrived there, right? And then we have a little bit of kind of a little chromatic thing. This is a little bit inspired by the great fugue in G minor. No, actually, it's a C minor fugue, I think. It's the one that I was talking about earlier. What's his face? Orchestrated. Edward Elgar. He orchestrated it. It has a really nice moment where this just says yum dum 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 dum, just this epic chromatic line in the upper part is it's just really nice moment where the two voices interact with each other. But that's somewhat what this is inspired for. So it kind of modulates to G major, right? Which is to be a very common to go to the relative major. Right, and of course this pivot chord is what's used. A minor functions as the 4 chord in E minor, and it also works as the 2 chord in G major, right? So it's a predominant in both keys, so it can lead very well either to B major to get back to E minor, or it can lead to D major to get to G, which is what it does. Cadence, G major. And what I was attempting to do here was be a bit cheeky. So we start out thinking that we're going to have it in the relative major, right? And that's another common fugal development, to take your subject and put it in major, whether parallel major or relative major. It's up to you. What we kind of did that, but what I did was I took this G major and I did a kind of a harmonic relativity thing, but still following the harmonic rules of the Baroque period. And I turned it into the dominant, right? So if G is the dominant, then what's the tonic? Well, it could be C major, or it could be C minor, right? And C minor is pretty far away from E minor, so I decided to be adventurous and go to C minor. But then once I got to C minor, I never really introduced the A flat, right? I do introduce the B flat right here, right? But first we introduced the E flat, so it's just like, C melodic minor, G leading to C minor. And then what happens is I immediately treat the C minor not as a 1 chord, but as a 2 chord, right? As a tonicized 2 chord. So if it's 2, then what's 5? Well, as it turns out, F is 5, right? And then B flat is 1. So now we arrive in B flat, right? And except I go into a quasi-deceptive cadence, right? So I go to the 4 chord instead of the 1, and then we do end up arriving at B flat. But it's important, the point that I'm trying to get at with all this is that it's important to save your root position 5-1 tonic for very specific moments, right? Bach does not squander those, right? So even if you're doing deceptive cadences, if you're cadencing in other keys, they often will be like 5-6-5 going to 1, or a deceptive cadence, or or the soprano doesn't go T do but goes Re Mi or something like that. Anything to keep it an imperfect authentic cadence. So you want to save your, T, Do, Sol, Do for like the triumphant moment in which you get back to E minor and it's like, okay, this is the end, right? Because they lose their impact if you use them everywhere. So that's kind of what happens here. You'll notice there's not really a full sort of harmonic cadence in this whole modulatory section. right? And then this is this is a little fun. This was something that I only would have composed late at night. So we have this ya da 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 da, right? You know, 2 of B flat major to 5 of B flat major, so C minor to F major, and then this right here, I thought, well, hold on a second, that A is common. That A is common to the B dominant 7, right? A is the 7th of B dominant 7, and B dominant 7 leads back to E minor. So I thought, oh, okay, I can use that as a pivot note, right? And it's actually not that hard to sing, ya da 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 dum, right? And then here, right? So I thought, ya da da dee da. What this sounds like is, it sounds like we're going from the 4 chord in G minor, because G minor is the relative minor of B flat major. It sounds like we're going from the 4 chord of G minor to the 5 chord, right? Because F sharp is the leading tone in the key of G minor, which that all makes sense where we were. We were just at B flat major, and so it's very easy to go to G minor because it's the relative minor, and then we have this leading tone. But again, you'll notice this F sharp, it is the leading tone of G minor, but it's also the 5th of, the 5th of the 5 chord in E minor, right? So these both work well as pivot notes, and then this C, right, it works as the root of the 4 chord in G minor, and it also works as the sort of flat 9 or in harmonic minor as the 6th scale degree of E harmonic minor, and so it leads very well nicely as a sort of like predominant kind of ya dum, and then down to B natural and down to E, right? So so all through the use of these pivot notes, which work in the previous key and work in the new key, and Bach does that and is quite adventurous harmonically, but that all of that sounds like this G major, which becomes dominant of C minor, 2, 5, 1. See how easy that sounds is because of these pivot notes, even though they're actually pretty far away. And so we arrive at sol do, right? And I was like, okay, right? But notice what I did was I thwarted the leading tone, right? I didn't give the leading tone in actual resolution up to E. I popped it up to re, right, and then resolved it. So just little things like that. So it's like, nope, still not full E minor cadence, right? So we get another stretto like we do at the beginning, and just to clarify for those who don't know, I'm sure you figured this out, but stretto is where you have, I think I explained this, you have successive entries of the subject before the old one finished. But it's important to realize that these don't always have to be canonic, in the sense that they don't always have to be at the octave. It's not like E minor, E minor, E minor. It could be, and very often is in Bach, E minor and then A minor and then D major, right? He'll dum da da dum da da bum ba da bum ba da dum ba da, and he finds ways to weave these together at at various intervals. So it's not particularly common to have a stretto at the octave. That's more like something, you'd be more likely to call this a canon at two points of imitation, than a stretto. But in any case, I just changed the intervals, right? So before we started at the top and we worked our way down, so now we start at the bottom and we work our way back up, and it's invertible counterpoint, so we know it's going to work. So I'll just play the lower voice first. Right, sol, do. There's nothing more final than that, and then of course now we finally do get the 7th, which wants to resolve down, and we get the leading tone in the soprano. So this is the moment where we think, finally we get an E minor cadence, and you'll notice I kind of fudged the intervals. I kind of turned it into a more harmonic thing. It's not an exact, because it would be a little bit kind of boring to just do exactly the same canon that we did earlier. So I kind of turned it into a, the bass entry is the longest and truest, but this one changes quickly. Right, and then this one. Sorry. Right. So it kind of morphs into a cadence. But what do we get here? Not E minor, E major, which quickly becomes 5 of 4. And this is what you would call a codetta. because we do get a root position tonic. We do get a root position tonic chord. It's a Picardy third, right? But this one chord quickly turns into a dominant seventh that then tonicizes the four, right? And tonicizing four is a very, very common thing to do. It's because it's like that plagal thing. You're kind of going on the other side of the circle of this, because it's sort of past predominant, so to speak. But that's a discussion for another time. But it's very, very common to like end on a cadence and then go ya da 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 dee da da dee da da dee da da dee da da dum ba da dum bum. You know, to have that type of a thing where you end on four, you know, and then it's like. That type of a thing. So it's something that happens after the structural end of the cadence, so to speak. And that's kind of what we get here. Kind of winding down over a tonic pedal. That's very, very common to have a tonic pedal like this. There's that sequence I was talking to you at the very beginning. Right? And so we're like, okay, are we gonna get a minor cadence, right? And we don't. We get this crazy harmonic progression, which I'll explain later. Right. So, a bit uber dramatic, I must admit, but, you know, I love a good bit of drama. Alright, so that is the first part of this video. So now I'm going to take a quick break, come back, and we will do an interval analysis. Alright, welcome back. So, let's get into this interval analysis. If you are intimately familiar with the rules of three-part counterpoint and the Baroque period, that you don't need to watch this. But if you're not, I think this might be helpful. It'll be a little bit tedious, but, you know, if there's no better way to learn counterpoint than just to do an interval analysis, okay? So first, we'll go ahead and do between these upper two voices, okay? So we have a third, okay? We have a dissonant fourth, which resolves by oblique motion to a third, fifth, fourth, which is really a suspension, which then resolves to a third. Then we have a sixth, fifth, sixth, parallel sixths, all nice, right? We have a dissonant passing tone. That's a seventh, which resolves to a accented passing tone. This is an example of where you can have the I don't think I talked about this, but you can have two dissonances in a row as long as the first one is an unaccented passing tone and the second one is an accented passing tone, right? So we have a fourth, which resolves to a fifth, right? And remember, that's okay as long as we have this, as long as the resultant sonority that you end up at is like a triad. And in this case, it is. It's G major and first inversion at open voicing. So that's totally okay, right? So fourth, it resolves to fifth, right? The fifth contracts to a third. We have a sixth, 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 fifth, empty interval, right? We have this tritone, right? And remember, this is that type of thing where we have basically just this whole thing is just B major, right? Right? And this is really an accented neighbor tone, right? And this is an unaccented passing tone. So we really don't need to worry about these so much. So when you see this tritone and you're like, well, they both need to resolve, right? It's not like a Lydian cadence, you know what I mean? It's not like what I was talking about before, right? Because you do end up getting this, end up getting that resolution, right? The only thing that happens is that the seventh moves up to the root, right? And that's totally okay. And that's another important thing to realize about just part writing in general is when you have a 5/7 chord, yes, the seventh needs to resolve down to the third of the one chord, and yes, the leading tone needs to resolve up to the root of the one chord. But they don't need to resolve if you move them or just sort of arpeggiate them or invert them to another. It would be easiest if I just gave a example, right? This is okay, right? We have this seventh, right? Right, and I'll make it even more controversial. I'll do this, right? right? This is okay, right? So we get this seventh, right? And we think, okay, we've got this tritone. The leading tone needs to resolve up, and the seventh needs to resolve down, right? And we don't get that, right? The seventh moves up to fa moves to sol. The seventh moves up to the root. And then that voice doesn't ever actually get the resolution to May, right? To the third scale degree. So it's not even as if we can explain it on a macro level like we do eventually get to the resolution. And the reason is because of the fact that these are both 5 chords, right? You can do, you can invert the notes and move them around however you want because there's no harmonic motion. You haven't resolved the chord yet. You're just moving to a different voicing of B dominant 7. So whenever you do end up at, the 1 chord, yeah, you want to make sure fa goes down to May and T goes up to do, yes. But before then, as long as you're just staying on the 5 chord, there's no harmonic motion, there's no harmonic change, it's just a revoicing, and so you don't need to resolve those tendency tones if the harmony hasn't resolved yet. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions about that. But that's a really, really important concept because a lot of people, I've taught counterpoint for a couple years now, and a lot of people, that's something that they discover. They're like, oh, well, JJ, you said that the, fa has to go down to May and T goes up to do, and they bring up those examples, and it's like, well, it's just changing from one 5 chord to another inversion of the same 5 chord, so there's no harmonic resolution. Okay, so where were we? We were over here. Yeah. So, right, so this tritone resolves up to a 5th, which is okay in this instance, right? And then we get this dissonance here, right? Accented dissonance, which resolves to a 6th, right? So we end up, you can have a lot of dissonance in Baroque music as long as it's handled properly. Especially, Bach. You look at some of Bach's music and you pull out like just one little sonority and you just play it by itself and you're like, holy crap, that's so dissonant, right? But it's, everything is. The harmony underneath holds it all together, and the fact that the dissonances are treated properly. But it's usually where you get accented and unaccented, right? Like right here, we get an unaccented, passing tone, which if it was inverted, it would be a 4th, so it would be a dissonance. And then we get an accented passing tone. So you can get 2 dissonances in a row. Sorry, this is a neighbor tone, right? So 7th, major 7th, which resolves by oblique motion up to a 6th, right? We have a third, right? A dissonant tritone, which resolves up to a and that's another thing to realize. If you have a tritone like this and the other note is just held, right, and they don't actually strike each other, you don't have to resolve, the tritone like you would if it were implying a dominant 7th chord, right? In this case, it's just a passing tone, right? You only have to be careful when they hit each other. Okay, so we get a passing tone, dissonant tritone, passing tone, which goes up to a 5th, and right here we have a little bit of counterpoint, which at 2-part level, if this were 2-part counterpoint, this would be unacceptable, but it's not unacceptable because of the bass, right? And because of the long scale harmonic structure. And the reason I say that is because we have a 5th, we have an octave, and we have another 5th, right? So that's okay. It's not like we have parallel 5ths, and it's all in contrary motion, so it's as good as it can be. But you generally don't want to have, 3 perfect consonances in a row. I think a couple of the reasons why it's okay. One, we don't really hear the C because it's just being held over, so we really only have 2 in a row, right? And then also, it's very strong melodically. And of course, is very strong as a bass line, right? And we do end up with this. We do end up with a imperfect consonance at the very end, which goes to another imperfect consonance, right? So I think your ears, and you'll listen to this and you'll probably hear it. It doesn't sound like a couple of cold, perfect intervals. It works well in this context. So, this is where that subtlety and context comes in. Anyway, so we have a nice 6th here, right? We have a passing tone, right? And you may think this is a direct octave, right? Because this soprano is leaping down to an E, right? And they're both arriving at an octave, but it's actually not a direct octave because of the fact that we consider this in counterpoint for all intents and purposes to be basically just this, right? It's just the same note rearticulated. Even if you move the octave, it may cause voice crossing problems if you're worried about that. But as far as the rules of counterpoint, if it's just the same note and you move it down an octave, you don't actually consider it a change of note, right? So this is not a direct octave, right? So we have an octave, sixth, sixth, and this is very common where you have an octave and one of them goes up and the other one goes down. Because remember, whenever you arrive at an octave, the best way generally to get away from it is to either expand or contract, right? If you expand, you get a third. If you contract, you get a sixth, right? And then you can just keep moving them in parallel because you have sixths and thirds, and they work great in parallel. So that's what happens here. And then we have a sixth, right? Turns into a fifth, which is treated as if it were a passing tone. So if we wanted to recycle this, it would be invertible counterpoint, right? We do have an augmented interval here. Technically, this is a major third. Like if you were to listen to it, it would sound like a major third. But we do have to treat it as a dissonance because it is an augmented interval. It's a diminished interval. It's a diminished fourth. But both diminished and augmented intervals are to be treated as dissonances. So it resolves to a minor third, right? And this is basically just 5 of 2 of 5 of 1 if we're in G major, right? So E dominant 7 is the dominant of A minor, which is the 2 of G major, so 2, 5, 1, A minor, D7, G, right? Hopefully all that makes sense. Right, so we've got this nice third here. We've got a fifth, right? We have a voice exchange starting with a third, which contracts to a sixth, right? So this whole measure is just full of imperfect consonances. Then we have a third, right? Because remember, when you have a sixth and one goes down and the other one goes down by a step and the other one goes up by a third, you switch from a sixth to a third. So we have parallel thirds. That's okay, right? This is a little much to have 4 in a row, but I think it's okay. I mean, there were times where Bach just literally had just a bunch of parallel 6 in a row. It's like the two voices sort of like became friends for a second, and they were sort of fighting with this other voice. That's something that he does a lot, which I think a lot of counterpoint textbooks don't take into account because they say like, oh, don't have more than 3 thirds or 6 parallel in a row. But I mean, Bach does it all the time. But he goes for it, so to speak. Like if he's going to do it, he does it for a long period of time, which I guess you can't really say about this, but oh well. I like the sound of it. It's not breaking any rules. Third, right? Dissonant fourth, passing tone, right? Which resolves to a sixth, right? And then we have a seventh, passing tone, which resolves to an octave, right? We have a passing tone, which resolves to a sixth, right? Sixth, right? Tritone, which resolves as if it were implying a dominant 7th chord. In this case, it's D dominant 7 going to G major, right? So C is the chordal 7th, resolves down to Mi, Fa goes to Mi, T goes to Do, right? Right? Voice exchange, right? Right? Same thing that we had before. 6th turns to 5th, turns to 3rd, 5th, 3rd, dissonant 4th, which is treated as a passing tone, unaccented passing tone, to a 6th, 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 right, bunch of 6ths. Dissonant neighbor, that would be a 7th, 6th, voice exchange, 5th, 6th, bunch of parallel 6ths. 5th arrived at by oblique motion, right? It's rearticulated oblique motion, but it's still oblique motion, right? Then we have a 3rd, a dissonant 4th, which is treated as a passing tone, resolving to a 6th, 6th, 5th, 3rd, and again, this type of thing would be invertible counterpoint because it's treated as if it is a dissonance. 3rd, 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 it's basically just a bunch of parallel thirds, but this is another thing that Bach does, is he'll displace the octave. Because what this could be, which is just this, right? But then, of course, we'd have voice crossing, and if you want to have a big leap up, it's generally, if you have a leap of the 7th, it's generally most commonly this type of thing, where, you actually are implying a 7th chord. Right? Because you normally have 5 7 chords. In this case, it's 5 7 of B flat major, right? So if you have the leap of a 7th, any other leap of a seventh in another scale degree, you don't see those very often because you don't really, the only seventh chord that you have in this style is the 5/7 chord, right? So if it functions, if you have this yada, like West Side Story, there's a place for us. It's easy to sing and easy to hear, even though it is a dissonant seventh. But in any case, it's a leap and then it comes back down by step, right? So it follows all the melodic rules, right? So voice exchange. You see how common voice exchanges are, right? Third, fourth, which is treated as a passing tone, sixth, third, and then we have third. All right, moving onward. Sixth, third, passing tone fourth, sixth, voice exchange, except for the note that's exchanged has a direct chromaticism, but that actually works quite well. Like if you want to go from G to G sharp, to if you have like a G major chord, and then you want to turn it into an E dominant 7 chord to get to A minor or something like that. One great way to sort of like cushion the direct chromaticism from G going to G sharp, which is a little bit awkward. I mean, Bach gets really chromatic and crazy later in his output, but if you want to mitigate that, it's great to have a voice exchange, right, where the G is switched down to the bottom, right, but because it's not G directly to G sharp, but you have this octave in between, right, it kind of softens in the weirdness of G going to G sharp, if that makes sense. Right, it sounds totally normal and totally fine. All right, third, right, dissonant, passing tone, second, haven't seen a second in a while. Third, and this is another easy way that you can achieve independence. If you just have parallel thirds like this, you can just make one of them into, take away the passing tone, and it still works contrapuntally, right? And you've given it a little bit more rhythmic independence. It's more dissonant, but, it can solve that problem. Third, fourth, suspension, which resolves to a third, right? Then we have this tritone, a part of a B dominant 7th chord. So D sharp is the leading tone resolving up to E, and A is the chordal 7th resolving down, in this case, to G sharp. Remember, it can resolve to the major third or the minor third, right? Mi or me. All right? And then we get a new tritone after this consonant 6. We get this new tritone, which is, again, 5/7 of, if we're in E minor, 5/7 of 4. So 4 is A minor, 5/7 of A minor is E, right? So if we build an E dominant 7th chord, we get the D, which is the 7th, and the G sharp, which is the 3rd, right? So the 3rd, the leading tone, resolves up to A, so it all resolves properly, right? And then the 7th resolves down. Thirds, parallel thirds, right? Another tritone, right? So we could consider it 5 of... It's a bit shoddy here because of the bass tonic pedal, but we could consider this, 5 of 3, right? So, again, we're still in D minor, so if 3 is G major, 5 of G major is D dominant 7. So that means C is the 7th, which resolves down to B, and F sharp is the 3rd, which resolves up to G, right? And if any of this is confusing, if it's like difficult for you to think, for any of you to think about... like, oh, we're in this key, so it's the it's very important when you're writing counterpoint or part writing. Like, one of the basic fundamental music skills I think everybody needs to develop is the ability to just immediately know what all the chords are in any key. Like, if I said E minor, like, what's the 4 chord in E minor? You should be like A minor, right? What's the 4 chord in G flat major? Oh, C flat major, right? You should, what's 5/7 of 2 in D major? Oh, B dominant 7, right? Like, that sort of, like, that's just something that just takes time to just develop. That level of competence, but it's really, really important, especially if you're going to like study music of Bach, which goes all over the place and changes keys very frequently. So it's important to just a side little thing. If you find yourself having a hard time keeping up with that's something where just like flashcards and things like that could totally help out, and I think it would be worth investing the time in that. Where were we? Yeah, so we got parallel thirds. It's basically just a sequence, right? So 5th contracts to a 3rd, 3rd, right? And this is where it gets a little bit dissonant, right? So we could think about this. This works out, right? We have an augmented interval, which does resolve down to. So really what we could think about is it's really just this, right? We have F sharp, right? And sorry, we have a minor third, right? And what happens is that it goes to this tritone, but it's like what we were talking about a second ago. It goes, this tritone does not need to resolve like it normally would because we're just going back or to any other note that works as a part of this B dominant 7th chord, which we're implying here to get to E, right? Yum, bum. So the only thing that happens here to complicate things a little bit, because you can start with these basic structures and complicate it, is we've added an accented passing tone, and we've also added an accented lower neighbor, right? So that all works, right? And this type of it's a very, very common thing, especially in late classicism and early romanticism. It's a new type of tritone that you can resolve, right? And it's where you basically build a 4/7 chord, which then goes to a 5. Think of it like you're a mean one, Mr. Grinch, you know. Right, you know. You could also think of Tchaikovsky's 6th Symphony. Right, you know. So that's, you know, a couple of instances of that being used. So this is maybe hearkening a bit further in history and not maybe not something you'd hear in Bach, but just to let you know. It got a bit uber dramatic over here. Right? So yeah, so we go from a third to an octave, right? 6th, dissonant passing tone, 7th, right? And then right here, when you start introducing all this chromaticism, then you sort of back off and don't worry so much about the augmented intervals and just whether or not they sound like imperfect consonances, right? So in this case, G sharp to F sounds like a minor third, right? And A sounds like a minor third. So if you wanted to think of this as a dissonance, it's just an accented passing tone that resolves to a major third, right? Then goes to a 5th by contrary motion, totally cool, right? And you'll notice I brought in a 4th voice here. I was thinking this whole fugue is going to be played by string players, which brings up another point. I'm not intending this fugue to be able to be performed by a pianist. That's not really. You know, you write fugues for all different kinds of variations of instruments, and it would be too much in addition to all the stuff we're talking about to also talk about how to make it playable for the pianist, which some of you may not be interested in, or the organist, you know, or any, you know. So we're just assuming that these are all individual instruments, so we're not worrying about things like, you know, impossible chords and spacing, as if you're a pianist, you obviously know at this point. Where were we? 6th. We have a 5th, right? It is a direct 5th, but both voices are moving by step, right? We just wouldn't normally see this case because of the lack of chromaticism, right? And then we get this tritone, which resolves properly, except this 4th is suspended and later gets its resolution, right? And this E just does an octave displacement, which, remember, it doesn't, for all intents and purposes, it's basically just this, right? When we change the octave, it doesn't matter, right? So that's very, very common, right? So the 7th is just resolving a little after the leading tone. All right, so let's go back and we'll do the bottom voices, and then the last thing we'll do is we'll do the top voice and the lowest voice. So, yeah. Okay. 3rd, 4th, accented passing tone. Yeah, you actually wouldn't consider that a passing tone. You just consider it. I mean, you would. You technically would. Actually, no. This is kind of interesting. That's the only reason I want to get into this, is because, again, articulated oblique motion and non-articulated oblique motion. You would consider this a suspension, is what you would consider it, because this note moves up, this note is suspended over, and then it resolves. So that's an important thing to realize there. So yeah, and that goes for all the other times that I was talking about that. It's technically a suspension. 3rd, 5th, right? We know how this works contrapuntally. This is the same as what we saw up on top. Okay. 4th, 3 suspension, 6th, 5, 6th, a bunch of parallel 6ths, right? 6th, passing tone, fourth, resolving to fifth, remember, and it's sweetened by this B up here. Before the B was down here. Now the B is up here. Yeah. Third, sixth, empty intervals, accented passing tone, seventh, which resolves to a sixth, voice exchange, right? Passing tone fourth, splitting out to a sixth. I mean, you're starting to see how common these things are. Voice exchanges are really common. Having a third and one of them sort of moves down by step and it goes out to a sixth. They just work really well and they make nice melodies and they're really, really, really common. You know what I mean? So it's not like you're having to enact full brain power and reinventing the wheel for every little thing that you write when you're writing Counterpoint. I mean, sometimes you are, but a lot of time, these little Lego building blocks like I was talking about, they work very well and there's nothing wrong with using them, right? Sixth, third, right? Really just spelling out an A minor chord here. Suspension, dissonant suspension, which resolves to a perfect consonance, right? And this is we have a bunch of B's in a row, so that's not particularly optimal, but it's okay because they're all arrived at by different motion. Okay, and it quickly turns into a more sonorous sonority, right? This B is basically just held over, right? We don't have to we don't need to consider octave displacement, but the suspension resolves, right? Right, and this is just a lower neighbor tone, which resolves back up to the octave, right? And then we have a third, a dissonance, which then resolves down. And it's also important to realize that we can drop out a note. You might think like, oh, we need this so that we can hear the resolution, but you actually don't need it. As long as the note that dropped out would have been consonant with the note that this dissonant passing tone has to resolve to, it's okay that we can drop it out, right? So third, dissonance, right, which resolves to a note that would have been consonant with the note that dropped out, right, and then we get that whole thing with the middle voices over here. Third, that 4-3 suspension again. Three, it's a bass suspension, so that's why it's contracting instead of expanding. Third, octave. And this is another moment where you get two dissonances in a row, right? You get a dissonant unaccented passing tone, and then a dissonant accented passing tone, right? So that's that case where we can have two dissonances in a row, an unaccented passing tone and then an accented passing tone, right? Right, and of course this all is reinforced by the fact that all of these notes are consonant with this upper voice, right? Yeah, where were we? Okay. Dissonant accented passing tone. Third, sixth, fifth, sixth, and again this is treated like a neighbor tone, so it would work as invertible counterpoint. 6 6 6 6 6 6. 6, voice exchange, right? Splitting out to a third, to a sixth, sorry, third, passing tone fourth to a sixth. Octave, which contracts to a sixth. Then we have this tritone. What is the tritone implying? A and E flat is implying a F dominant 7 chord of B flat, right? So the leading tone A resolves up to B flat. The chordal 7th E flat resolves down to D, right? Dissonant neighbor tone 4th resolves back down to a third, right? We have a accented neighbor tone. Right, a second, which resolves back to a third, a third, fifth, right? We have a tritone, right? And in this case, the tritone doesn't resolve like it would, right? Because remember, this whole thing is basically just a B dominant 7 chord, like we talked about earlier. But it does resolve to a consonance, Oh, and that brings me up to another... I don't want to stop this for a second, but that brings me up... Let me know in the comments if you would be interested in me doing an interval analysis of like this, of like one of Bach's fugues. Because I'd love to... Because, there's a certain amount of credibility that, I'll explain... I don't want it to seem like I'm explaining away things in this music. Like, oh, well, normally you do this rule, but it's fine because, I did it or whatever. I want to make sure that it's clear that like everything that I'm doing in this fugue, with the exception of maybe the very last coda, are things that Bach does all the time. And so I'd be happy if any of you are interested. It's a pretty kind of tedious thing to do, but if any of you are interested in me doing an interval analysis of any of Bach's fugues as a sort of maybe last part to this series, let me know. So in any case, third, right, fifth, right, and then, right, in this case, a fifth going to a fifth going to a perfect consonance, a fifth going to an octave is okay because of the fact that it's a part of a cadence, right? When you have re, do, and sol, do, right, you have to have a fifth going to an octave, and the octave has to be arrived at by direct motion, right? So remember, we're at a cadence, we can do that, right? We have a passing tone, sixth, right? And remember, this is basically just this with the octave displacement. Fifth, sixth, and again, this is treated, we saw this earlier, but here's a perfect example, We saw the way that this worked out earlier, and remember, this was considered to be a suspension that resolves up to a third, but in this case, it's a fifth that resolves up to a sixth, so you can see how the intervals change when you invert it. Sixth, fifth, sixth, voice exchange, right? Octave arrived at by contrary motion, right? Basically just that, right? Dissonance, passing tone resolves to an imperfect consonance, a third, right? 4, 3, except for that it's now a minor third, right? And now we don't have to, because this is just a tonic pedal, we don't have to consider any of these dissonances, so we can kind of skip forward, right? Third. We have a tritone, which resolves to what sounds like a major third, right? So this is a little bit odd right here. This is something you would only hear really in the Romantic period, to have a tritone that resolves to an augmented interval. But it is technically a vertically, it sounds like a major third, right? Now we have another third, a minor third, a major third. So a bunch of imperfect consonances. Major third, right? Right, and then finally here we just get the normal cadence. We get a fifth, seventh, right, and then 4, which resolves to 3, right. And remember, this it's okay to have a dissonant seventh, and also have a dissonant fourth in a row, right, because this is that 5-7 going to 1, right. So dissonant seventh, and then 4 is okay as long as the 4 resolves to 3, right. All right. Let's back up. We get another swig of coffee, and we will do the soprano and the bass voice. Okay. So, fifth, octave, right? Which is okay because it's oblique motion, technically speaking. Right? We have a dissonant seventh, which resolves to a nice sixth, right? Fifth, third, dissonant neighbor, right? And remember, we have an unaccented dissonance followed by an accented dissonance, which is totally okay. Right, so second, which then resolves down like you want it to. B and B. An octave. Sorry, my brain is dying here. 4 resolves to 3. 4 by oblique motion. Fifth. Seventh, passing tone, which resolves to a third, excuse me. And we have another one of those things here where we have an octave, right, and then an unaccented passing tone, and then an accented passing tone, which then resolves to a third, right, which contracts to an octave. And we have accented passing tone 4-3. Right, we have parallel thirds. Fifth, third, which expands to a fifth. Sixth, accented passing tone, which resolves to a sixth. Octave. Fifth, like we saw before, basically just the oblique motion. Sixth, octave, right? And then we have this 4-3, which resolves to a octave, right? And again, to reiterate, that direct perfect consonance is totally okay because it's at a cadence, and it's 5-1. Okay, right here. Third, accented, unaccented dissonance, right? A seventh. Sixth. Excuse me. That was not a third. That was an octave, right? Now we get a sixth, and now we get an unaccented passing tone, right? Which resolves to a fifth. It's not as common to not have these resolved by oblique motion, but if both are moving by step, it's okay to have like a seventh contract to a fifth. You generally want to have another voice, which is what's happening up here, you know, something like that, or so this is not super common, but it works technically as long as both voices are moving by step and contrary motion. The 90% of the time it's just a seventh, which contracts to a fifth. You don't generally see it in inversion because a fifth would turn into a fourth. It's not invertible counterpoint, because if I inverted that and had something like, you know, rather than if I inverted it and went, you'd have a second, which splits out to a fourth, and a fourth is a dissonance that can't be resolved to. So that's the main reason why you don't see this type of motion super commonly, is because it's not invertible counterpoint. Fifth, sixth, dissonant passing tone, right? So remember, unaccented dissonance followed by accented dissonance, which resolves back down. It's an accented upper neighbor, basically. Resolve to octave, right? Right, and then you have a fourth, and remember, we can use fourths and not resolve them as long as they constitute a triad. And do we have that? Yes, we do, right? E flat, G, and C makes a C minor triad, right? So that's totally okay. It's a 6/4 triad, and needs to, you know, in a larger scale harmonic context, it would need to resolve to a G major chord of some kind, which it does. It does in this context, but yes, that the interval of a fourth is okay if it's sweetened by an imperfect consonance that makes the whole thing constitute a full, complete triad. Okay. And a side note, I'm at bar 26, so let me remind myself where I am. Highlight, but just FYI, because I think you'll find this interesting. Sometimes Bach uses fourths in two-part counterpoint if it's an incomplete, if it's like you're just playing two parts and you're gonna add the third part later. Sometimes he actually, believe it or not, you know, I'll give you an example. So this is from the C minor fugue. Let me make all this and the second voice. But I just want to give you this example because I think it'll be useful. Do a little interval analysis here. Right, you all should recognize this. Gotta fix these where it's not. Make sure these are all right. Yes, that's right. Okay, I'll just play this first. Yeah, there should be a D flat there. But yeah, so sixth, which split out to an octave, right? Dissonant, unaccented passing tone. Sixth, right? Voice exchange, except there's a passing tone, right? We have a third, dissonant augmented neighbor. And look at this, look at here. We've got a fourth, and the fourth is not resolved by oblique motion. You know, it does resolve by contrary motion to a 6, but I think the primary reason why Bach thought this was okay to have this was not only the fact that it resolves, you know, nice contrary motion to a 5th, but also because of the fact that later on you do get this, you know, you do get this. I can't. My keyboard is not big enough for me to play the fugue. But in any case, he adds later on the B flat, which makes it a full triad. So in this case, that's something that he hardly ever. I can't think of a single spot where he's done that, like in his 2-part Inventions. But in a 3-part fugue, apparently he thought it was okay because you're gonna hear the B flat with this thing later to sweeten it up, which is kind of interesting thought. If any of you are intimately familiar with Bach's works, let me know if you have any other theories about that. But that just reminded me of that. Okay, yes, back to here where we were. Let me turn highlight off. How do I turn highlight off? No. How do I unhighlight? How do I unhighlight? I guess I'm just gonna have to leave it highlighted. Sorry if that bothers you, OCD people. But anyway, so we get a 4th, which in any case, like Bach did over there, we have in the 4th, yeah, the 4th is sweetened by the 3rd in this case, but we have it splits out to a 6th, right? Voice exchange octave going to a 3rd, right? And we have another 4th, but again, this 4th has an A, right? C, A, and F makes an F major triad, right? So the 4th doesn't have to be treated as if it's a dissonance, right? And we have a B flat and G, which is a 6th, right? Which expands to an octave, right? And we basically just have an anticipation here, right? This note moves up to a B flat and anticipates the next B flat, and then the A resolves down to G, right? So that's we haven't talked about anticipations, but that's what that is. Oh, this highlight is bothering me so much. I don't know how to undo that. Dang it. 3rd, minor 3rd, right? Suspension. 2nd, which resolves up to 3rd. 3rd contracts to octave. Dissonant passing tone to 6th, to 5th, to 4th, right? Which resolves down by oblique motion to a 3rd. 3rd contracts to octave, right? We have a passing tone, dissonant, 7th, 6th, right? Nice consonant 6th. 6 splits out to octave, right? B, right? And then we have this dissonant passing tone, which resolves to a 3rd. Okay, moving forward. We have a 4th, which is not treated as if it's a dissonance, but it's okay because we have this G in the middle, right? B, G, and E constitutes an E minor triad, so that's totally okay. Octave, passing tone, right? 3rd, passing tone 4th, 6th. Oh my gosh! Look what we found. Aha! That's what I get for being not doing an interval analysis. We have parallel octaves. That's hilarious. So I think the solution here, I'm kind of glad this happened so you can know how to, I think the solution here is to move just down to this A and just stay there and let these upper, because these upper voices have enough activity as it is. So let's make sure that works, right? So we have 6 resolves to an octave, which turns by passing tone into a 3rd, contracts to an octave, right? That all works. We did that, and then now we'll test it with the upper voice. We have a 3rd, we have a 5th, 4th, which resolves by oblique motion because this B is octave replaced. Okay, so that works. That's a better solution. We found an error. I didn't do an interval check of this. I was just writing, so there you go. Always good to check your intervals. So this new version sounds. Yeah, that sounds better. Yes. Voice exchange. Right, yeah, 5th, 4th, 3rd. Talked about that, right? Right, and we don't have to measure any of this stuff with big bass. All right, so octave, minor third. We have tritone, which does resolve properly, right? The D is the seventh, which goes down to C sharp. G sharp is the leading tone, which goes up to E. It's these inner notes that make it weird, right? Accented passing tone, which resolves to an octave, right? Then we have another accented passing tone, right? 2, 3, which resolves to a major third, and then finally we get this direct octave, which again at a cadence is totally okay. Let's go ahead and check this fourth voice. Thank God we weren't writing a 4-voice fugue the whole time, otherwise that would take up so much time to do an interval analysis. But we have a sixth, a dissonant seventh as a passing tone octave, splits out to a third, right? And then we have this accented chromatic passing tone, right? Which is a dissonant second, right? And then the dissonance is escaped, right? This resolves where it wants to, and we resolve to a consonance, right? Sixth, right? And we give re, do, and ti, do, very common, right? Expanding outward to an octave, right? And then the chord is just rearticulated with a different voicing. We have a tritone, right, which resolves to a fifth, right, and it's, again, in this weird harmonic context, it's okay, right? We have a fourth, which this fourth is a neighbor tone, which resolves up to a minor, we do have parallel fourths here, but I think it's okay because of the fact that we have this third up on top. It's kind of like Faubert-Done, where you have parallel first inversion chords. And then the only difference is that here we get an accented passing tone on top. So I think all of this could conceivably work within the Baroque contrapuntal system. It's just very much stretching the rules. I just figured I'd write it to kind of, to show you all, just for the sake of having fun and seeing how far you can stretch the system. And Bach did stretch the system very far. Right. And then we have a sixth, right? And then fifth, which turns to a third. Totally cool. And then finally with the bass, right? Boom. That sounds like a major sixth. I'm not even reading the notes. That's where your ear can be really helpful. When I check intervals, I'm so bad at reading sheet music that when I check intervals, I don't even look at the I can tell that's an octave just by listening to it. So that you're developing your ear is important, because then you don't even have to read sheet music. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, we have a sixth, seventh, right? And so we do have two dissonances in a row, right? But they're both sevenths, right? It's just you have a chromatic shift, and you do get the resolution to a sixth, and that's something that happened a lot in the Romantic period. Definitely something that wouldn't happen here. But you could have two dissonances in a row, like two sevenths, and they were both different chromatic versions of the seventh. So you have a major seventh and then a minor seventh, and then the note resolves. So we still technically get a seventh that's resolving to a sixth by oblique motion, but we get two sevenths. One of them, we get the two chromatic alterations of the seventh. But yeah, that's definitely something that came later in the Romantic period. But anyway, it resolves down. It's really just a suspension. This B is a long suspension, which resolves down to a sixth, right, and then to an octave, right, and then perfect fifth, which resolves to an octave, okay, by contrary motion. Whew! Okay, man. Let me see if I can at least just undo. No, because I changed this to not be parallels. That highlighting is annoying me. I got to figure out how to fix that. It's funny. Okay, so let's go ahead and hear this. This is just the ending of the fugue, too. We still got to write the beginning. So, and before I play this and we kind of head off, again, let me know whether or not you want me to do, was that good enough for an interval analysis, or do you want me to go ahead and, everything that I write do an interval analysis? I'm totally cool with doing an interval analysis for everything, but I also don't want to, bore the living daylights out of people who are okay, I get it, I know the rules of counterpoint. So just let me know, or maybe, I could, I don't know, put like a time code in the video where you could like skip the interval analysis if you wanted. So just let me know in the comments, as always. Be as honest and blunt as possible what you want to see out of this series, what's going to be most helpful to you all. So yeah, go ahead and play this. Nice. What fun. Oh, one last little thing I want to do is sing our parts. Very, very important to make sure they're all singable. What fun. What fun. All right, now we'll do the middle line. Boom. I'm switching octaves because my voice range is not huge. I always want to go lower for that third and make it just. But alas, the piano does not. And now finally the bass line, which of course I'm not going to sing it in the octave. So I hope you got something out of that. Yeah, I will see you in the next video.